Welcome to Out of the Blank.
Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank podcast. I'm here with Deborah. Deborah, introduce yourself to everybody out there listening.
Hi, I was the editor of the magazine in the UK and Ireland, and I retired a couple of years ago because I needed a break. It's a fairly intense kind of a job. And I talk about folklore, particularly dark folklore, why people believe in vampires, werewolves, zombies, fairies, blood-sucking creatures of all kinds, just as much as they believe in gods and angels.
Why do you think people believe in that so much? Is it maybe possibly because every single movie or anything on TV really happens to do with one of those things that you mentioned?
Well, all the movies I watch do, yeah. I mean, they've got great entertainment value, and I think now that we live in an era where we're a little bit separated from real peril, perhaps we can afford to indulge this sort of dark frisson that we've got without suffering so much. So yeah, we like the themes, but people, honest to goodness, even before movies, even before novels were widespread, believed in this stuff. And that's where the folklore comes from. So I'm interested in why people believe in the natural way of things in dark folklore.
Okay, so natural ways, but is it linked to like a fear narrative? Is that what it is? People just love being scared. I mean, I understand like the comfortability thing, especially in today's time. It's a little bit more comfortable, I would say, to survive than back in the day. In some cases,
Yeah.
obviously, but back in the day, they had these types of myths. Today, people still believe these types of myths. I mean, there's people out there that supernatural ghost hunt. They say
Yeah.
they've seen a werewolf or a chupacabra or even alien stuff as well too.
Yeah, I think the most useful thing you can do is to remember that you only get answers to the questions you ask. So you have to be really, really careful about the questions you ask. And a lot of people ask, why do we believe in this stuff? I'm quite interested in how do we believe in this stuff? The mechanisms of our normal, perfectly normal functioning psychology that make us intuit that things that don't exist are there. And I think a lot of this stuff can be accounted for by a lot of normal adaptive psychological processes. And these are just the side effects that don't really matter. So if you're talking about an individual human being, watch Professor Chris French for a really, really great lecture on this. It's about all of the mistakes we make while we are perceiving things. And I'll give you just one example here. One is that for good evolutionary reasons, if something weird happens, we will tend to intuit there's an agent in the environment. So you might look around and you might discount it, but first of all, you jump and you're looking for something. So we're hyper attuned to faces, you see faces in clouds and things like that. So I think our individual psychology helps us to just be on a knife edge, and we should be, because let's face it, being a little bit jumpy is more adaptive than being completely complacent. And the other thing is that then when we get into social groups, because we have language and we have traditions, then we are able to produce stories that tend to have fairly normal mechanisms and themes. And these mechanisms and themes come out again and again. And we tend not to have folklore about shoes, because who cares about shoes, and not everybody has had shoes throughout history. But we do tend to have folklore about, say, childbirth, because it's quite an amazing thing to produce a totally new human being out of nothing. There are issues of paternity, ownership, responsibility, and there are also big issues around death, because giving birth is very hazardous for human females, and it's very hazardous for the children they produce for quite a while. So these stories that we tend to tell each other are fixed around the really important parts of our lives.
The the zombie one and the werewolf one aren't really too far. Like I can understand those. The werewolf one is like a man turning into a beast, which is kind of like
Yeah,
raw power or some type of primal thing with it. The zombie one is just wanting to know what's after death, and death not being the final state. People want to think that you
yeah.
can come back in a sense. I mean, it links in with like maybe a more modern version would be like Frankenstein or something like that. But when it comes to like even I guess ghosts, you could probably chalk that in too. But vampires, immortality, like every single one of these things has a basic, I would say. I mean, it's still happening today. There's social vampires, people that leech on like a social situation.
Oh
But
yeah.
the folklore idea behind them, I mean, they all make sense in the idea of creativity. I'm just wondering what makes a creative mind want the ability or the fear, just the fear aspect of things. I understand the awareness aspect. Like paranoia for some cases is it's not a bad thing. It's good to be aware of your surroundings, but if you start thinking like there's helicopters and people are tapping your phone and everything like that, and you work at like a FedEx place, that's probably not true. And that's
Yeah.
when it goes a little bit too far. But this idea of like being scared or there's a mystery out there, something that's unexplainable, something that is not from this world or is no longer part of this world. It's just that's what I can't wrap my head around. I mean, I get the belief, but
I think you touched on several really valid points there. It's interesting that you were talking about social vampires, because actually Voltaire mentioned that he said the stock jobbers and brokers, he thought the people in financial services were vampires too. So he was using that allegory way back then. It's immediately useful. We know intuitively what it means, even if we don't believe in supernatural things. I think it's important to differentiate between the folkloric versions of these things and the literary version of these things. And we're at a point in history now where we can partake of the literary stuff and the film stuff probably more than we do of the folklore. And there are differences between the types of stories you get and the functions of them. And so we might end up confusing the two of them. To take an example, our vampires are very aristocratic and lonely and sexy. You think about the number of sexy vampires that have been in films.
Twilight.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Twilight. Well, yeah, I don't rate Twilight so much. I don't know how you feel about it, but it's the one we all love to hate, isn't it? But yeah, there's so many sexy vampires, and folkloric vampires might have been interested in sex, but you wouldn't have wanted to have sex with them.
Yeah.
So they sometimes went back and would have sex with their wives. So their wives would wake up in the middle of the night, feel a pressure pressing down on them, and think, oh God, he's back and he wants this again. So, but they were conceived of as sort of rotting corpses, very unattractive. So as we all know, there is a difference between being sexy and just wanting sex. So it's just an example of how it works out differently sometimes, the literary versions and the folklore versions.
Well, it's insane to think about how the culture is literally preyed upon those aspects. I mean, even in movies, for instance, has been some type of horror film has had scary monsters or ghosts, and even a lot of literary works as well too. When it comes to the horror series, that's the first thing people think of.
Mhm.
It sparks up a lot of following, especially I bet your favorite people are probably cryptid people that go and try and hunt down these cryptids, Bigfoot hunters, and
Yeah,
I'm hoping there's a Yeti out there. That's my favorite
yeah,
one. But you start hearing accounts of like in the Tibetan mountains that they have records of this, and then not even across the country they have Bigfoot remains or whatever they're talking about, pictures of Bigfoot. So it's like you're having these cultures have these ideas long before the age of the internet, long before the cell phone, which makes it, I guess, a deeper question is like, is it linked in with psychedelics people always bring up, or is it just people's brains, like the creative processes? We all kind of let's say like if I have an idea, someone else around the world could probably be having the same exact idea at the same
Yeah.
exact time, or maybe before me. Could it be that type of thing, or is it something a little bit deeper than that? Because they get realistic and very, very close on these records where it's like the details almost the same. There's just a slight difference that makes it a different species or a different variant.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not hugely informed on cryptids. Although having said that, I know about werewolves, so I guess that's me. Yeah, I guess that would be a cryptid. Um, and the thing that doesn't help us with cryptids is that we know for sure that we don't know everything about the environment, and we are discovering strange new species that we didn't know about before. I mean, I don't think it was until the 70s or so that people had found a coelacanth, really, really primitive deep sea creature. And it looks funky as hell. I mean, it's really
Dino
odd
fish.
looking. Yeah, yeah. And if somebody had just seen that on the deck of a boat in the 17th century, you would have gone, oh, well, it's cryptid. But now we know it's a coelacanth. So we are unsure of our knowledge, which is a good thing. With a lot of cryptid stuff, I'm kind of tempted to look into the environment. For example, the Loch Ness Monster. I don't think there's enough protein in the environment to support an animal of that size. Whether it's a meat eater or a plant eater, it doesn't really matter. Ultimately, you've got to have enough protein, enough calories in an environment to support a large creature. And Bigfoot would be a slightly different one because it's a slightly less knowable environment. You can't know about every inch of the forested land that it comes from. But what you can see with a lot of this investigation is you can see people who've got an idea and then they're going out searching for the evidence that will conform to that idea. And in an ideal world, what you would be doing is actually just looking for from ground zero and seeing if you could find anything.
I think there's a
Um,
point to a healthy skepticism or a healthy
yeah,
belief, but my issue is what happens if you have someone that approaches you and they're a Bigfoot hunter and they've sold all their like they sold their house, they stopped seeing their kids, all in the search of Bigfoot because they want to drain all their money into that. I mean, how do you disable a bomb like that? I mean, even for me, if I'm passionate about something, I'll go full into it, but I'm not going to, destroy my own life. And a lot of these things they turn into that. I've met a couple of people where it's like they've gone past the point where there's talking to them and convincing them. You literally have to strap them
yeah.
to a chair and be like, look, zombies are not going to attack you while you sleep. Stop taking drugs and stop reading folklore. Like at a point, you have to draw a line. I'm just curious to how do you disarm somebody, or maybe how do you explain to someone that maybe their belief might be a little bit over, I guess, dramatic or maybe over exaggerated in a sense? Because I mean, like I said, it's all over our culture. So
Yeah.
that's getting like every single way they turn, every single way they look is just seeing this constant like werewolves, vampires. It's like, well, everyone's thinking about it. So there has to be some truth in it. I might as well go sail Scotland and, do whatever. Like that, there's a point where you have to realize that maybe the thing that you're interested in has become more than just an interest. Now it's taking over your whole entire life.
Well, there is some truth to it. It's just not that the creature exists. It's that there is a that there is a psychological and a social psychological process which leads people to believe in it. So if somebody ends up on the belief end of the spectrum rather than the analysis end of the spectrum, I personally would say that they've kind of gone for the wrong angle on it. As for somebody being fervently occupied with these subjects, I don't think there's anything you can do. There's a certain set of sort of personality traits um, which will lead to this kind of stuff. And hopefully, if somebody is embedded within a social group and a family, then it's just going to be mitigated a little bit. But if they weren't crazy about the Loch Ness Monster, they'd be crazy about collecting comics from the 70s or crazy about, mining for metal or something like that in abandoned fields. I do a fair bit of debating for in sort of in a religious environment and or answering religious questions, and something that I always think is that you are never going to change the mind of the most fervent people in the room. You're not going to change the mind of the person you're debating against. You don't seek to do that. You seek to change the minds of the people who haven't made their minds up in the middle. And all you can do there is to offer your most reasonable arguments in a reasonable way. People do respond to things on a personality level more than they do on an intellectual level. I think people's personalities are far more influential in their fate and their beliefs and everything than their intellects. But yeah, personally, I wouldn't waste my breath on someone who is over the hills and far away on that kind of stuff. But think about the 5 people around them who are listening, because, and this is something I would definitely say to skeptics, is, if while you're debating in this in a public forum, don't be a dick, because you're not, the people who are listening are not going to go, oh, I want to be like that dick. They're going to listen to a person who they feel has been reasonable and okay about it. And also people hold opinions for all sorts of good reasons, reasons that are good to them, and they don't deserve to be made fun of for that, especially publicly. It depends exactly what they're saying and in which context, of course. But you know what I mean, in
Yeah.
general. I don't know. I think if somebody really is extreme on any of this stuff, I don't know if there's a lot you're going to be able to say to them.
Well, when like if you're researching or like studying about a certain folklore or just maybe of it for an interest, do you ever get like maybe a little bit convinced, or does your thoughts ever change? Like from when you first started, when you were openly, going and having a debate or something like that, have your thoughts changed from then to where they are now?
Yeah, I would say that I started off as a believer. I started off as a believer as a kid. I was terrified of poltergeists. I was absolutely terrified of even the concept of poltergeists. And I had an experience when I was about 8 or 9 years old, which had an incredibly profound effect on me, which was that I was lying in my bed at night. I woke up in the middle of the night and I could hear a noise. I could hear it. I mean, I was not hallucinating. It was a few feet away, and it sounded like somebody getting a load of pebbles in their hand and just like juggling them like that. So they just went up and went down, and you could hear them knocking against each other. And I heard that, and obviously, there was nothing in the room that I could see. And then there was this awful clang against the radiator in the room, so noisy. I could hear it. This wasn't a nightmare. I could hear it, and I I called there and I shouted for my parents, and I didn't want them to go. And I was so scared, and I knew I'd heard something. The next day, I'd got this this Norwegian coin that my father's friend had given me, and I stuck it to a piece of paper on the wall. And what I had heard was that the sellotape wasn't man enough to hold the coin up, and it was slowly peeling. So I could hear this, and in an instant, I had created an image in my brain of somebody doing this with some pebbles. So I instantly had an explanation for this noise, which would have been very difficult to think around once I'd got it. And then, of course, the coin fell down onto the radiator, made a clanging noise. I did hear something, but it was totally, it was what a psychologist would call top-down processing. It's using the ideas that you already have in your brain to provide you with an explanation. We don't invent everything from first principles every second of our waking lives. We don't have the bandwidth. So we use a combination of incoming stimuli and the idea that's already in our software. And I came up with something, and it was totally wrong. And I scared the living daylights out of myself. And I think it was the beginning of, it was the beginning of thinking a bit more reasonably about these things.
Well, it's like shadowy figure syndrome. Seeing a shadow figure
Yeah.
in your room, your eyes just start playing tricks on you because your brain's trying to find the images and trying to create. Usually, it comes with people who are overly creative. I've talked to neuroscientists and I've talked to alien experiencers, and
Mhm.
it's a sign of like sleep paralysis, which is seeing like
Yeah.
from stories I've heard of like an alien coming into the room, picking them up, and then taking them away. A lot of times it depends on their age, but it depends on their amount of creativity that their brain's going because your brain's just running off and trying to think of whatever that noise is. It's
Yeah.
hypothesizing and trying to create that image in your head. And then after a while, memory starts to get a little bit shaky and you start thinking that's exactly what it was. And
Yeah.
it becomes an issue because it's so hard. It's not even a belief. It's just so hard when people think that's 100% fact because they remember it. And it's like, well,
Yeah.
your brain is taping up images or taping up the memory. And it's really not like that. It's actually something so simple. I remember when I was a kid, just because you shared a story, I'll share one.
Yeah.
I was
Yeah.
a kid laying in my bed and I had a drum set in my room at the time. I was like 6 or 7, and the way that the street light was coming in through the window projected the drum shadow on my wall, but it looked like Abraham Lincoln with his top hat. But
Yeah. Yeah.
the part where the drum kit connects into two pieces was where the mouth was, and it looked like really sharp, razor sharp teeth. So I freaked out, but I never did
So
anything. I
you
just
had a
sat there and panicked.
vampire Abraham Lincoln.
Yeah, so I mean,
Yeah.
not like the movie. The movie was a lot better, but when I was a little kid, that I remember I was freaked out. I mean, for like a couple of hours, I was just sitting there staring at it. But when I was a kid, I couldn't sleep. I was an insomniac, so I would just sit there and stare all over my room or something, and my brain would create people moving. It just like it gets weird because on top of that, it's like someone's watching you, and then you start
Hmm.
getting that feeling like you got eyes peering on you, and then it's like, oh, it's 100% real. Don't hop off the bed before someone grabs you.
Yeah. Yeah, it totally is. And I've had quite a bit of sleep paralysis in my life. I'm totally used to it now. Um, and you do tend to hyper identify figures and faces and all this kind of thing. So now, if I'm lying in bed and I wake up and there is somebody looming at the bottom of the bed, if it truly is one day, I'm going to react so slowly because I'm just going to think that they're a figment of my imagination. Um, they'll wonder why I'm being so complacent. But the thing, I really do feel sorry for people who have it because the fear is biological. You know, you do have to cope with the fact that you've got sort of like a zip of adrenaline going through your body, and you have to think, I'm not in any danger, and just wait for the fear to pass.
Yeah. And do you think that it took a lot of the wonder out of, I guess, the belief, like being not really a skeptic? Well, you are a skeptic now, but like before,
Mm.
when you had that mystical belief and they had this thing that was like, oh, it was a ghost or something like that. Do you think that like now that you've kind of analyzed and you're able to more critical think on a lot of these aspects, that it took a lot of the mystery and fun out of it? Like that's why when I see someone who's like so in belief of it, I'm just like, I don't usually say anything, or I usually don't go, well, maybe it was this or maybe it was that. Because in a sense, it is wonder as long as it's not hurting anybody. The problem is that sometimes they can get very aggressive in their actions, and that's why you have UFO Twitter.
Yeah, I know what you mean. I mean, it's kind of, yes, I think there is a little frisson that is lost. Um, on the other hand, I can watch any horror film you like because I won't get scared watching it myself because I know it isn't real. I know plenty of people who can't watch any horror films at all. Um,
What about arachnophobia? Can you watch that movie, that arachnid movie with all the giant
I'm
spiders?
not. I'm spiders don't bother me at all.
Oh my god, that's something to me. When that dude was sitting in the barber chair and he leans back and the thing jumps. Ah, no.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Funny enough, yeah, I think probably, little spiders don't bother me because you see little spiders, and massive spiders wouldn't bother me because that's just ridiculous. The ones that scare me are the middle-sized ones because they look like they're just like the little ones, but they're just far more potent. They're like little terrier-sized things. They could actually run 20 miles an hour after you.
Mine's the detail of them. When I see the detail of like the hairy legs and stuff, it just freaks me out. I mean, that's what all monsters have, like some basic distinctive traits, usually sharp claws, sharp teeth,
Yeah,
hairy, usually a lot of hairs involved.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And that's incidentally why I think because people have asked me, I work in the film industry too sometimes, and I've worked in sort of creature effects and things in the past. And people have said, oh, why are there so many zombie movies? What is it about zombies that people love? And I said, well, I don't know if I can give you a movie critic angle on that, but I can give you a creature effects budget view on that, which is that werewolves need a lot of hair work. So, from a creature effects point of view, werewolves are expensive. If you're going to have a werewolf movie, you've got an expensive movie on your hands. So, zombies are comparatively easy.
Yeah,
They,
today's culture is just beating zombies out basically out the window. Walking Dead did it, and then I think
yeah,
I phased out around the fourth season of that. But it's interesting when you see something new, and I think it's taking its turns around. Like I wonder when we're going to see another werewolf or vampire film. I thought Underworld was the end of it, which
yeah,
actually sparked my interest up in werewolves in general before Twilight even came out. I've only seen like one movie of it, so I'm not going to sit there and say it's my favorite. But
yeah, yeah.
there's not really any like I do prefer the older style movies where they really never showed you the monster, probably because it was going to cost too much. But everything's so
Yeah.
CGI now, even though it makes it look like, oh, you get to see the full werewolf transformation. To me, sometimes it just seems not like real. Like I prefer when they do like the Star Wars style stuff where they dress up in the actual gear and they
Yeah.
go and do the stuff like that. That to me, I'm more of a fan of, but.
Well, actually, funny enough, for hardly seeing the creature, people say it's sci-fi, but the movie Alien was a horror movie because it was like instead of a haunted house, it was a haunted spaceship, and the alien was played like a horror creature, and hardly seeing any of it until right at the end, I think made it a lot scarier.
Hmm. Yeah, I was always a Predator fan. I don't know.
Oh yeah, oh yeah,
Something about
Predator. I
those.
love the first movie.
Yeah, something about those creatures. See, once some type of creature starts trying to lay eggs inside of you and all that, and to get a person burst out of your chest, that's just too much. I'm like, all right, man, I'm not interested in that, man. I don't need sleep tonight.
What do you think of the sort of the ghost movies of the last kind of 10 or 20 years? Because there's been some remarkable ones, haven't there? Including some quite sympathetic ones, The Others and I mean, I guess Pan's Labyrinth wouldn't be quite the same, but it there's been some really, really great stuff. Oh, and The Orphanage. Oh, I love those Spanish movies.
I don't think I've seen that one.
Oh, you have to.
I think the best ghost movie of all time, hands down, has to be Sixth Sense. When he finds out he's dead, like, come on,
Yeah,
that's just a classic. I don't know. I want to see something different, but honestly, I
yeah.
feel like if someone just took a folklore book or some type of monster book and actually searched through it, they could probably find some good ones. Like, how come there's not really been like a serious like Kraken movie, which is like another one of my favorite cryptids. Like I said, I like learning about them, but Mothman, all these ones that get talked about now, all the ones that get put on pop culture t-shirts. I mean, in my experience, it's cool that it keeps the legend alive and gets more people looking into it, but they characterize it up too much. It's kind of like the issue with Winnie the Pooh. Like
Yeah.
everybody was like, "Oh, bears must be all cuddly." It's like, no, they're not. They're very, very vicious creatures, and that's
Yeah.
kind of what I'm not saying those things exist, but you'll have people out in the woods thinking that they're going to come across something and then probably end up being attacked by something.
Well, if they go out in the woods in North America, yeah, they stand every chance of being attacked by a bear. I think the largest mammal we've got left in the UK is the fox, and foxes don't attack you, so we're okay. But yeah, I mean, you know, there are real hazards out there.
What's if I had to ask, what's your favorite kind of thing to not really I would say debunk would be a good word, right? Like what's one thing you typically try and like is your area of expertise if I was going to ask you out of all of them?
I would say that it's kind of the context of belief. So, for example, there was you could read the history and you could think that in the 18th century somebody invented vampires, and they came from a certain place in Eastern Europe, and uh, they were disgusting and rotting, and people put stakes through them. Right, so you've got a certain amount of facts there, but it really matters that the politics of the situation, for example, because the Ottoman Empire was receding. The Ottoman Empire was it wasn't a great place to live, but it was a bit more religiously liberal than the Habsburg Empire, which kind of went over it. So, so what you had is a new group of administrators coming in and saying, all right, we're administrating over these peasants here. You would never guess what they are doing. So the fact that vampires come into Western history at a certain period of time really, really matters in the politics. The religious background, the fact that people were able to practice a certain kind of religiosity, which was Christian, but which had pagan threads still running through it, that matters from a historical point of view. There was a class issue going on here when you read a lot of vampire accounts from that kind of that stripe in Eastern Europe. This was something that was done by peasant people, and in fact, sort of middle class and upper class people like to look sniffily down at their nose at people who did this, people who would go and examine corpses and put stakes through them or set fire to them. So there is an awful lot of context which is very, very important, and it informs us about how and why people come up with certain beliefs at a certain time. That werewolves in Europe, for example, so the thought that there is a continuum between the animal world and humans, I think is probably fairly intuitive to us, or certainly intuitive to our ancestors. And in fact, the idea that the whole world and its life, that we're in a continuum somewhere.
Well, that's largely popularized by Native American cultures as well too.
Yeah,
Mostly transferring into an animal or some type of spirit animal as well too. It's been shown a lot in at least today's culture. If you look at any type of like movie that involves a beast, it's usually a transformation of that sort, or getting bit by something that would cause a transformation of that sort.
yeah. So people who live technologically unadvanced lives still know about the concept of contagion, and they still know about the concept of other animals kind of being like us. They know they're not identical. They know they don't have language or towns or, can't smelt bronze or iron or whatever. But nonetheless, they do know that they're on the same continuum. And I think it takes quite a bit of intervention to make someone think that they are sitting kind of on top of this, that they are separate. It's probably taken like 2,000 years of monotheism to make us so special in the eyes of God, in a way that dogs and wolves and ants aren't. And so, the traditional way of taking a wolf as a totem animal, or of taking on wolf-like characteristics that people might desire, they might decide that they're as fierce as a wolf or as fierce as a bear. That turns up throughout history. But there were people actually tried for being werewolves in Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries. And it's a very, very different phenomenon. And you really need to understand the background of religiosity in Europe at the time, about Reformation politics, about how the kind of concept of heresy ended up turning into demonology and witchcraft.
Yes.
And so so what I would say that I try to do is to try. I'm quite happy with the idea that somebody goes, oh, a werewolf, that's funky, because I think it is too. I like them. But if you're going to seriously approach the subject, you can't just say, wow, weren't people dumb back then? Because they weren't, but they were in a very specific set of circumstances. And that generated some trials for people being charged with being werewolves.
My example I usually use is that you get used to the situation that you're in, such as like we have technology, for instance. Now, graphics back in the day look horrible now, but all you knew back then was that. And for
Yeah,
instance, I had a past guest, her name's Lainey. She studies the Salem witch trials. And
yeah,
we were talking about that. A lot of the books that they were reading were books about witchcraft, were books about the
yeah,
like spiritual books as well too. It
yeah,
brainwashes the people to start thinking that everything around you, if someone does something or throws something, like if I throw a pencil into a trash can and it lands in there, that's witchcraft. There's no way you could have made that shot. You must be casting a spell or something like that. Burn them at the stake or drown them. That's when it starts to become an issue, which is like what I was mentioning earlier about people that actually believe this stuff. Because after a while, society starts to get brainwashed. I mean, even now it's in somewhat mind controlled or brainwashed in a sense when it comes to just hating each other instead of having
mm,
conversations. Everything's been turned into a debate where people feel like they need to argue, and if they lose or if they don't agree, they just walk away from each other. In a
yeah,
sense, that's okay if it's going to get hostile, but I think you need to talk with people and have a sense of conversation to be able to explain and identify actual real core issues, or we're going to lead down another path. I mean, like for instance, everybody now on Instagram is like an astrology or psychic that'll read your tarot and all this, it does a real disservice to the people that might actually feel like they have some type of thing and they're actually trying to help people. I'm not saying that's good and I'm not rationalizing that, but there's a lot of people that are just trying to scam other people. That litters the whole work of art for them, whether you want it to be
Yeah.
destroyed or not. That's their perspective, obviously. But when it comes down to just people wanting to have a fantasy or a dream or belief, the dangers of where that can go as well too, if people start to actually try and sell their house and do all those things and hunt down Bigfoot. Doesn't even have to be cryptids. That's just the most obvious example because there's people actually go and hunt Bigfoot. Same thing with
Yeah.
aliens. Is there a possibility that there could be extraterrestrial life out there? Sure. Bill
Yeah.
Nelson from NASA said something about it. But when it comes to like your neighbor thinking that they're a demon or they're a ghost or they're a poltergeist, look up the amount of people back in the day that had exorcisms in their house. A priest would actually come to your house and do those types of things. That's where you start to get a bit like, is the person really possessed or are they just looking for attention? And in a lot of cases, it was looking for attention.
Oh, there were so many poltergeist cases where there were young people, usually young women, looking for attention. I think that you bring up several important and interesting points there. The first thing I would say relating to Salem is that it was it was late for a witch hunt in European terms, but of course it was a colonial place, and it was very insular, and that's one of the places where you get witch hunts is when people can't escape. Right now, if you really cannot stand the town that you live in, it's going to be hard because if you don't have loads of money, but you can move, you can change your job, you can do these things. In traditional societies, traditional villages, you can't do it. You're so interconnected and a web of dependencies that if things become unbearable, if people accuse you of something, you cannot escape. And the opening salvo in a witchcraft accusation is usually intended to socially cut somebody off. So what it is, it's an official way of saying, I'm not bound into my social obligations with these people. And you can sometimes intuit festering resentments and unhappiness that's been going on for maybe 20, 30 years that's just built up to this point. The thing that you point out about kind of like medium-sized belief, if you like, being harmless, it's funny, I don't know where to stand on that, because I spoke to a woman the other day, for example, whose father was a Jesuit. She's about my age, so he was a Jesuit and he left the priesthood because he was shocked by some of the unspeakably evil things he saw. He just couldn't buy into it anymore. He still remained Catholic in a very, kind of calm kind of a way. And what he did was he brought his kids up in a very, very laid back Catholic kind of way. He gave them somewhere to go if they wanted God or if they wanted, religious or spiritual beliefs. And the reason he did it was because, first of all, I think that he probably maintained his own faith. He just thought that the Jesuits as an institution weren't a very valid way of expressing it. And the second thing was because he felt at the time there were all sorts of New Age cults going around. One of the earliest was the Moonies, for example.
Still going
And
on.
yeah, is it really?
Yeah.
Okay. And he felt that if he gave his kids a kind of a mild version of religion, that it would inoculate them a little against the really extreme versions, that they weren't going to come out thirsty for some desperate meaning later on and then just go off with something completely weird. So, and that's offered as an excuse for religion. I mean, we're not getting rid of religion anytime soon. It's a waste of time even trying. But when people discuss the dangers of it, this is offered in return as one of the potential, benefits of it. And I don't know where I stand on this. I think the place I stand really is that people, you do what you like, but you keep
Yeah.
church and state separate.
That's where I'm at too. I'm not a religious person at all, but I just believe if someone has a belief, I don't have any power to want to take that away from them at all. As long as
Yeah,
it's not inflicting on someone else, then that's where the
yeah,
line is. Uh, but when it comes to, you mentioned something earlier about people back in the day were very intelligent as well too. It's not an intelligent thing of why people choose to fall into these holes, is it? This is like, it's a corrupting power move. In some religions, it's a power move. In some types of political things, it's been polarized as such. I mean, for the past almost 3 years, people have been in lockdown for a very, very long time, not being able to see certain members of their family. But it's a fear narrative move as well too. Like, don't go outside. At the beginning, we thought if we talked to someone, they were going to die. Obviously, the data has changed and everything has kind of went
Mhm.
along as well too. But it's always been that like 100% type thing. I mean, the most easiest thing you look at is climate change. I mean,
Yeah,
they're constantly throwing something at your face, and I'm like, be careful because when you say something, even if it sells, even if it gets views and clicks, as a news source or a corporation, you should be understanding that the public is going to react as such. And a lot of times, eventually, after you keep throwing red lines at their face, they're going to stop taking you correct, I guess, taking you
yeah,
for face value.
yeah. I mean, the problem with news corporations is that they aren't charities. They've got to sell. They've got to sell newspapers. They've got to sell, looks on their website, views on their website. So I think your media actually in the UK as well. I was going to say your media in the USA is can be pretty bad, and but so can ours as well. It's not particularly uh, representative of the way the world really is. And so it's up to us really to be careful about how we curate our news feeds and our brains, because people aren't people aren't implanting news for charitable purposes. They're trying to sell clicks.
Well, it's the same thing from the fear of vampires and witches back in the day is what we're dealing with now, just with different, I guess, problems. We're dealing with climate, we're dealing with race, we're dealing with, and some of those actually have real issues that need to be handled as well too. But those aren't the ones that get highlighted. They just do whatever is going to attract the most attention or get people the most riled up. Which, in my aspect, I look at like, what do you think in the next couple of years? Do you think it's going to get to another point where you have people doing way more like back in the day, riots? Even I mean, we have riots today, but I mean a global type situation where people are afraid to talk to other people. I mean, it was like that during the pandemic,
Yeah.
and I consider that a test step in a way. I mean, if they can have everyone afraid to talk to their neighbor or be locked inside of their house, and then now we're out, how long until we go back into a situation like that again?
Well, I think one of the reasons why what I do is not entirely frivolous, there is some, there's some use value to it as well as just interest for people who are interested, is that I think studying witch hunts is really, really important uh, because you can have the dynamic of a witch hunt without having belief in witches. And I think you can see it in politics a lot as well. And it's kind of when you look at, somebody might be wrong. They might truly be wrong. They might deserve to be put out of office. Perhaps somebody more competent should come in. But it's when you see the dynamics of the witch hunt that you start going, ooh. I don't know if you've ever been in a crowd. I have several times where there's kind of like, there's a thrilling sense because everybody's pulling in the same direction, or uh, they're shouting or cheering or whatever. And you can, it's really exhilarating to be in a crowd like that. And if you ever feel like that, you should really think about it, because it's not, a bit more individual thought is probably called for. One of the things I think about our present situation is that, um, and this comes from, I guess, from the historical context of a lot of the stuff I study, is that there are three massive things that have happened in the last, call it 20 years. Computerization sort of happened in 1980, but really, let's call it when the internet totally took off, the turn of the millennium. So lots of early adopters had it before then. I certainly did. But that's when it became central to most users' lives. And you've got the internet and social media. That is a massive thing. That is a massive piece of technology. And technology really, really changes lives. Think about the effect that the invention of the printing press had on witch trials, for
Yeah.
example. The second thing is that we had a financial crash, and the reverberations are still being felt now, and it's caused a massive fracture between generations because of the what is available for people now as opposed to 30 years ago. And the third thing is a pandemic. And a pandemic which really, truly killed people and will probably cripple a load more. In addition, it's caused a lot of damage to economies.
Well, it's entered us in a
So,
misinformation era, basically, where now if a couple things can't be wrong, everything has to be wrong, to where it's hard to understand what the
yeah,
truth is. I mean, everything, the mismanagement of the pandemic compared to just online anything, it's nobody could take it at face value anymore. Basically, it's like cherry pick whatever information you like the best, and that's the one you're going to run with. It's like,
and
well,
that's the one you run with. Yeah,
which is the
and
truth?
I do worry that and especially with social media, I think that it's very difficult to look. It all depends what you mean by is not a great headline. Nobody wants to sell nuance because most people don't read down 2 paragraphs. So um, if you want to balance the misinformation out, you have to be prepared to invest a certain amount of effort, and a lot of people won't do that, I guess. Uh, and I think that people are. You've only got to look at social media for various issues to see how incredibly antisocial people can be to people who they've never met.
It's that disconnect. No profile
Yeah,
picture for a face or no name. That's their actual name. That's why I used like your face and your name when you come
yeah,
on my show, is because there's a more of a connection when I get to know who you are and you get to know me a little bit as well too. But
yeah,
online, when someone says something, you're not seeing that person. You don't know what they're thinking of. You don't know what state they're
yeah,
in. I could put up a tweet or something, and someone in my family could have been like died that day. Nobody cares if
yeah,
they don't agree with it. They're gonna comment and they're gonna hit you with whatever they feel like because
yeah,
everyone's at level 11. It's like driving your car. You're not
yeah,
supposed to be there, even though you got in your car happy. Now you're angry because someone cut you off and you're driving. It's just there's like a
yeah,
subconscious fear over there as well too. I think internet's great because it allows
yeah.
you to
Me
look
too.
up and connect with people, but people in some cases aren't really using it in the best of manners or forms.
Yeah,
Some people being people that rather just start fights or constantly retweet fear stuff. It's like in a lot of ways supposed to be positive and help you connect. That's why I'm curious when you're doing research, for instance, or if you're trying to learn about something or maybe get a better idea of a certain situation or a certain folklore or anything of that sort. Do you typically look what's happening in the area around it? Like, do you look at
oh yeah.
okay, because I feel like that probably links in with a lot of what people, if everyone's thinking of, I'm afraid of wolves and I'm afraid of bears, and then not even a day later you see werewolves pop up. I'm like, yeah, that's why.
Well, one of the things I do in a talk I give about werewolves is that I've got a little wolf icon for a trial of werewolfism, which was a charge associated with witchcraft. And a lot of them happened in France or the borders. And I've got a picture of France, and it's a geographical picture. So it's got sort of mountain ranges and plains and everything on it rather than cities and stuff. And um, I put pictures of the werewolf trials, and it happens in mountains and kind of rural areas because that is where they have wolves. Wherever they might find that there is a different hazard. There's the same personal impetus to find a scapegoat for something, but the form of your scapegoat will be a werewolf in a place where there are biological wolves because it's an idea that's kind of to hand. Yeah, so for context, there's, for example, a woman called Alice Keiteler who was accused of, it was kind of witchcraft, heresy, sorcery, kind of a charge in the 14th century in Ireland. And the interesting thing about her was that there are all sorts of things that could make her eligible for being thought of as a sorcerer. She was from an immigrant family. She herself was naturalized where she lived, but she'd come from a rather wealthy Flemish family. So there was money involved. People might be jealous. She'd had 4 husbands as well. And the second husband, it's thought that possibly she and her second husband got rid of her first husband. So there's all kinds of stuff.
It's funny because even the second time, this is our second time recording this part because we had an internet issue. I thought of the same exact joke. I was like, 4 husbands. So I was like, did they all fall downstairs?
Ha! Well, this is what somebody thought. I mean, actually, I kind of by consequence of this, she was a very wealthy woman. So she was clearly very wealthy and capable in her own right. Anyway, she could run her business. But being an heir for 3 dead men, and then the last one is not a bad idea either.
It's suspect.
Yeah. So, but she had an awful lot of support in the area as well. The really big factor for Alice Keiteler was that was that she was chased relentlessly by a bishop called he was very aptly named Le Dread, if you ever wanted nominative determinism there. And yeah, Bishop, I think his name was Richard Le Dread, and he just went after her, and he finally won. Alice by then had absconded, and we don't know what happened to her. But he got her very close friend and servant, Petronella de Meath, and she was flogged and burnt at the stake. So it's truly officially horrific, and it was done because of this guy's mania. He had spent time in southern France and was very tied up with the Inquisition and with the suppression of the Albigensians, the Albigensian Crusade. So he'd followed on that whole, that it was where witch hunting started intellectually. It didn't really peak till a couple of centuries later, but this heresy thing, and also in the early stages of the Inquisition as well, you were allowed to forfeit. The person forfeited all of their worldly goods if they were found guilty. So beware of perverse incentives. That was definitely a perverse incentive. It meant that the estates of these people were split between the inquisitors and the local secular authorities, which meant that kind of all the local rich people were accused of stuff because there was money in it. So really, she suffered because of this guy's monomania, and because of he seemed to be a deeply disliked person. Nobody seemed to really like him, but also his background, his intellectual background, and where he was at a certain time and place in history. So big things can happen in history through very small knots of influential people.
That's why I guess you should really kind of be wary of people. Just one person in general has enough power to change the minds of people. I mean, they're influencers. There's really a specific thing for that now. Back in the day, it used to just be the Pope. Or, I mean, there's social influencers. There's people out there that are doing something that literally sway people's opinions in certain ways. It kind of explains why society, everyone's kind of looking for the Jesus on a cross. They're looking for that person that they can blame, or they can do something like that. It's just,
or a person who's going to have all of the solutions as well.
yeah.
Are you looking for your perfect person you can just plug into everything? I saw something funny on Facebook the other day. I don't know if it's true or not, but apparently Gwyneth Paltrow starts off her day with alkaline water with a spritz of lemon, which, of course, if you've done any science at all, you will know then makes it either neutral or acidic water. So you can, whether that is a true anecdote or not, the fact is you can look at Gwyneth Paltrow and you can see how an awful lot of people are just looking towards one person to try and feel sort of clean and capable and dynamic, and whatever they're going for. There's this one role model, and she has stuff to sell them.
It's like people want to make themselves feel bad by admiring their, I guess, life through someone else's. Like, everyone's looking for tips on how to be successful, but nobody's really applying those tips. They're just looking for someone or they'll celebrate somebody's success in a sense and take a piece of it for themselves, which is even worse.
Yeah. And also, I think critical thinking really should be taught in school at a very early level.
100%.
Because I heard a DJ once on the radio over here say that because she kind of she was in a modeling agency, got a TV job when she was 19, got onto radio. She's kind of up to 40 by now. And she said, I didn't know what was going to happen, but I always knew it would work out. And of course, to somebody who's trained in critical thinking, that completely ignores the survivor bias. We all know when something works out that people will internalize the qualities that were necessary for that. So it will be down to your excellent work ethic, or your excellent way of doing things. Whereas in fact, a lot of it's luck, and there were like 2,000 other people who also knew it would be fine, and it wasn't. So when you hear an anecdote like that about how people can be successful, you need to know about statistics and how you get good statistics instead of meaningless ones. And you could, you can make something of that anecdote if you know about statistics. And I bet a lot of people who were listening to that didn't.
A lot of people who aren't religious probably uh look that way at it too, but people, whenever they say, oh, I knew it was just going to work out, it's kind of hinting at a religious kind of intent or a factor that it was chalked up to something bigger than you,
Yeah.
which, I mean, it's okay, but for everyone it's not a perfect fit. I mean, like, I don't like it when people always bring religion into the concept, because for someone that doesn't believe in that type of thing, like, I wouldn't discern anybody for it, but you can't just Bible beat people around it a lot too, and so a lot of the words we say.
But I also think that for social justice, we have to understand the way that we um, the way that we routinely think wrongly. So we are likely to take the blame for good stuff that happens to us. We're likely to take the responsibility. So
Why would you brag about the things you don't have? Nobody does
yeah,
that.
I did X, Y, and Z, and that's why I'm a millionaire. And then completely ignoring the other factors, the structural factors. You could be the most intelligent, dynamic, sociable person and be born in an isolated village in the Democratic Republic of the Congo and not have access to public school education. And guess what? Your life isn't going to work out the same as a kid who's born to wealthy parents in North America or Europe. So, but the big thing is that people don't tend to take responsibility for those kinds of things. So you push away some explanations, you gravitate towards others. So we have a very weird idea of how the world works and how the world works around us. And it can lead to, I think in capitalism, it's led to some very cruel self-justifications.
It's definitely a bunch of people trying to stick their hands in the pot and claim it as their own.
Yeah.
Um, Sadly, that messes up future generations. I think that's throughout history, whether it's folklore, whether it's myth, whether it's just stories that get told throughout time. They have a cause and effect, and a lot of times, like with the Yeti, for instance, that was just a thing for that parents made up so their kids would be afraid to, not eat their dinner and do those types of things. That's like where it kind of started from, and then it evolves from there and evolves from there. Next, you got people wondering if it's real or not. I mean, we don't think about the snowball effect of things, but if you just look up like social theories out there, it's so fascinating how many people like, I mean, the research that gets done in these things. I'm sitting there like, that's what I do in my free time. I'm looking up philosophical theories and all this. I'm like, man, I get it. This could definitely fit for someone, but it doesn't fit for everybody.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the thing about sort of, I've recently been doing a lot about fairies, and obviously people did have ideas about genuinely believing in fairies, but it's surprising the number of stories that ended up where people at the end were kind of, these stories were told in a social environment. It was usually told by an older person who was known as the storyteller. They would be sort of winking and said, oh yes, well, old Seamus, he might have seen a fairy, or he might have been on his way back from the pub. So they were self-conscious about the purpose of the stories, about them being morality tales as well. Perhaps some of that context is lost to us when we read about folklore now.
Yeah. Well, Deborah, I really appreciate you for giving me your time and doing the podcast. Is there a place where people can find your website, any other links that you have, your Twitter handle as well, too?
My Twitter handle is Jourdemaine, that's Joudemayne. And my website is deborahhyde.com. You'll find links to the other social media there, Facebook and Instagram. I tend to spend most of my time on Twitter, I guess.
I'm on Twitter.
If
I
you want
follow
to
you.
I'll be on Twitter, yeah. And thank you so much for inviting me. It's been a lot of fun.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank. Stay tuned for our next episode.